Hi, Ramey. Thanks so much for answering my or getting in touch with me about Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And
Um, I really appreciate that someone and that you are doing some of this work. Thank you.
so I'd like you to, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I'm going to ask you four questions around Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance specifically. But if you want to talk about Persig in general, that's fine too.
Okay. Well, I was born in Boulder, Colorado in the
Mm,
early 70s. And and that alone offers some reflective privilege that you don't necessarily have a chance to be aware of until you have a chance to be aware of it. Um, I'm the youngest of three. My mom raised us. She was the first woman in the one of the first women in the United States to sell ready mix concrete. First woman president of the Colorado Contractors Association. So for me, growing up in Boulder, Colorado, which is reputed to be a pretty liberal place, I also kind of understood just the nuts and bolts of what it took to be a community, just the people doing the work, and the infrastructure that has to go in place for everything to function. So that was kind of the general atmosphere that then Boulder also attracted in a certain way of looking at the world from religion or intellect that brought a certain kind of person or um, uh, pool of calories in a sense of ideas and conversations that would also bleed into the Republic of Boulder and whatever that represents to folks. So it was in that, and then an injury in high school, a concussion in 1987. Um, that really my introduction then to Pirsig and Zen and the motorcycle maintenance in the early 90s really helped ground some of that infrastructure that I had already had some experience and knowledge of to kind of trust my own experience of it rather than try to displace the responsibility or awareness outside of me.
okay.
Um,
Oh, so you're getting into my first question. Let me just that's going to definitely going to be in my first question, and thanks um, for going into that a little bit. Could you just tell me you're in Alaska? Is that where you are?
yeah, in 95 I moved into Alaska, just outside of Fairbanks in the interior here. Yeah.
Okay, and okay, so that's an interesting place to live.
It has proved to be um a welcoming challenge.
Okay, so let's get into these questions that I'd like to ask. So the first one you're starting to get into, which is tell me about your relationship and history with Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And of course, we're kind of focusing this on Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance due to the 50th anniversary, but you can speak more broadly about Persig as well, and his influence on you, and maybe even Lila, if that's if those are things you want to talk about.
Yeah, and I took advantage of our limited time and that intro there to try to set up
I'd say, yeah.
more of where this is going to go because um my introduction to the book was really just accidental. It was very purposeful. um a friend of a friend was taking a class, and one of the books in the course was Zen on the motorcycle maintenance, and that social reaction, witnessing how others kind of teased her about that and what's that all about, and so my first introduction to it was just one among many of those different texts that my peer set were experiencing early in university. The reason that it sticks out and the reason that I go into it like this is my concussion, being kicked in the head during a gym class.
Mm.
I missed 2.5, a little over 2 years of school, non-concurrently, and the prescription that I got from the neurologist at Children's Hospital in Denver was really one of neuroplasticity, and so it wasn't staying within the system, and It was the school said, we don't want a lawsuit, so good luck. And they let me try to lead what that would be. There's a lot more to all that, but it was in that process then that Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, as a tool among peers talking about what they were going through, and then later taking that same class a year and a half, a year later, and having that book be one of my books, then I kind of hit the ground running, not just with Zen or motorcycle maintenance, which, my aunt and uncle drove BMWs and motorcycles in the 70s and toured. Like, I didn't know BMW made cars until I was in my teens. So like, there was a lot of things in the world that were very familiar to me already. And so then learning that this was already a published experience told me that it wasn't about Pirsig. It wasn't about this alone or Phaedrus. And it also didn't have to be about my experience alone right then. And so without having to face it, it offered me a way to kind of test where the thin ice was and where it was thicker and where I might pursue how to continue to make sense of these same things, but uniquely through what that experience continued to reveal. And so now the reason I go into it like that is that then I had problems with the university. I had problems with higher education. And so then I found that those that had come a generation before me had already done some work in anticipation of early career. And they were working with things like interdisciplinary studies. And so at the University of Northern Colorado, there was a program that had 3 credits required, and then the rest of it you had to defend, you had to build. So for me, instead of seeing that as a way to get away with something, it was a chance to actually dive into something without the same systemic controls. And that's, in a sense, why I ended up coming north and then found a philosopher here, Dr. Rudy Krejci at the University of Alaska, who was a philosopher of the history and philosophy of science. And so then to meet someone else who then would dovetail Viktor Frankl and Sir Karl Popper and more of that history and philosophy. And Rudy hated Zen, like Rudy hated the Eastern stuff. But this work, how do you stay oriented as a responsible person and then surround yourself with capability to continue to practice the work? Learning about Pirsig and Zen told me it's okay that it's not certain and it may not work. And then what?
Well, you would try something else, right? Wouldn't Pirsig say that? If that doesn't work, you try something else?
And so it was immediately in that space where this university of my undergrad is attempting to, kick me out of university for holding them accountable to the education. And I'm exploring these ideas, and then Lilla comes out. And it's another way for me to not be objective with the path that I was on, but it was a chance to see how someone willing to be vulnerable with their expertise, with their questions, and then also with the demands of that prescriptive technology of society and economy and strangers and infrastructure and permissions, borders. And so right at that critical time, it was then another, like a life jacket in a sense, that says, hey, buoyancy, I also don't know where I'm at in all of this right now, so you're okay. And so, for Zen on the motorcycle maintenance for a decade, I read it every Christmas. And it wasn't because I needed it. It wasn't because I meant to. It was because it was appropriate. And not everybody had a chance to take the time to stay with that work. Like for him, perhaps, sitting in a room contemplating these things, his peer group around him didn't understand it. For me, sitting in a room contemplating these things as a concussion survivor, in high school and stuff, I had a very different scenario in Boulder, Colorado, and then with Key Club, and yet it wasn't a privilege that I could take advantage of. It was a privilege I had to understand the context to account for, to take responsibility for. Did I get too far into the weeds too fast?
Well, could you tell me what you mean by taking responsibility for? Give me an example of what you mean.
Well, oddly enough, what just came to mind is that when the BBC documentary just came up within the last few weeks, I shared that with somebody that's a dozen years older than I. I'm in my early 50s. And they shared that they really enjoyed the book. They read it once, they read it twice, and then they heard an interview with Bob and with Robert Pirsig, and they said at some point in there, somebody said something, "Oh, I loved your book. I actually read it twice." And he says, "Well, if I'd written it any better, you'd only had to read it once." And that person that I shared that with, when they were reflecting back at me, it's like they took that personally, like they took offense at the author for saying that. And that misunderstanding, in a sense, is kind of what I mean by that responsibility. Like when we sit with someone or a classroom or a colleague and we say, "Are you okay? Is this quality? Are you hurt? Are you being heard?" We have to know what we're communicating. We don't have to prove to anybody else the truth of that or how sincere we are or anything, because our awareness of that present moment and what someone else may be authentically going through, instead of trying to be there for them, sometimes the strongest position to be there for someone is to really know your orientation and then to be response able from there.
That makes a lot of sense.
That's the motorcycle maintenance.
Yeah.
And it's in that space where the classic romantic and even the dynamic static, that's where that all kind of bleeds together. And it allows kind of for that relational choice.
Yeah, I really like that statement, that phrase you just said, a relational choice. So you're saying something like, if you are lined up with quality in yourself, which you can sense, right? Because Phaedra says you know what it is. Then from there you can have the highest quality relationship with someone else and be prepared to meet them where they are, even if that's a space of vicissitude, right? Even if that's a space of emotionality.
Yeah,
that's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. I mean, because ultimately, right? The fundamental physics of it is that there's no difference.
Meaning that you and the relation itself, there's no difference between you and the other in the relation. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, in the collapse of that agreement. Like, if we're both strangers and we're running to catch a bus in a city, and I'm trying to get to the hospital because my aunt just had a heart attack, and you're late to get to the conference, and you're from, and I make the bus and you don't, it's not like our reality is necessarily any different. Because let's see, what I was going to try to do is to make that kind of like, when cells are dividing, and when we're born, and then how our heart and our lungs and how, it is phenomenal. It really is phenomenal that we operate at all, and that we collapse on in a moment to say now, and that we might say blue, or we might say joy, and that we have something in common even with this screen between us, right? I mean, this camera and this,
Yeah.
and yet there's a feeling, there's an awareness. There's, when I said a bus in a city in a conference, like there's something in that that you still filled in, and it may be different than what others might. But in that, instead of trying to tell you how to paint the picture of bus and city or blue, I can trust something between us and now, this presence. And in that collapse of my ability to respond, only knowing what I'm responsible for, what I have control for, is a giving to the possibility of reality popping in and out of existence for us to manifest what's going to happen next.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. To me, what you're describing is the quality event.
Yeah. Without any border, like without any term, without any definition. It's like the supernova and the black hole.
Mm-hmm.
And that you only know that there are two of those there because they're in this incredible dance where one is so dense it's sucking everything in, and the other is so dense it's just radiating everything away.
Yeah.
And so the gravity of each of those, knowing the core of what they are, and then the relationship that they have with others, and that data taken in over time, is the only way we can know that those two things exist at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and one of the ways that I described it the other day is, like people talk about wagon wheels, and you got to have your spoke and your core, and then as many of the things radiating out, and then, distance and how fast you can go, but you're still kind of linear. And so instead of it being a hub, if it's more like nucleus, it's more like choice. It's more like, in a sense, conscious quality, awareness quality, that you give up trying to have an atmosphere to capture it. And you really only have to distill the primary experience of it. And then, almost like galaxies and stars and black holes and everything, it's in all of us honing to our own core of that then quality can help move everything around. Mm-hmm. Like dark matter, in a sense.
Yeah. So you're kind of saying that interplay between the supernova and the black hole is perhaps one way that you could represent all relations.
Yeah. And so instead of having the wagon wheel with unidirectional, what you do is you have it as an orb. Mm-hmm. So that if you run into something and you have momentum, you just keep going, or you change direction. And instead of it being something like, an orb sitting on the ground, those membranes are choices as well. I mean, physics, right? I mean, like at some point we have to decide where we're going to decide what's reality. And so, like, if you're a stranger that's injured, I'm not going to argue quantum physics with you. Like, I need to make the choice to extend care,
yes.
And it's in that then that milieu of quality has a chance to work with us, rather than us try to find it or work with it.
That makes sense. So you had one particular passage, and if there's others, I'd really like to hear about them as well, that was important to you in terms of this book. And that passage was, I don't actually have that email. Do you remember which passage we were talking about? You sent me a picture of a page.
I think that's just there's a few that I've tweeted. Or
why don't you give me your top three if you can?
Yeah, early when he's talking about what he has in mind is a type of Chautauqua.
Yes.
And there's that paragraph around that. And in Boulder, Colorado, years ago, there was a Chautauqua started. It was one of the sites that was started. And so, again, the book and Piercing, but it was just another sample telling me that this is something bigger than Boulder, than Piercing, than this book, than me, And so that quote is important to me. And I think there's the passages of when he first gets to Montana, and he's engaging with his previous colleagues, and they're talking about the instructions for the rotisserie, or I don't, some appliance or something. And you know, and Chris says, you know, what are you going to stick to? And he says, my guns, boy, I'm going to stick to my guns. You know, there's a hubris to that, you know, and there's also a defensiveness, there's a vulnerability to that, and that rawness to say, okay, here's my data, and my data may not be great, but I'm willing to learn, so here it is. And that's uncomfortable for many others in positions, you know. So there's that dynamic in that dialogue, and then the whole thing with Montana, you know, running into the former student,
Mm-hmm.
and that, you know, there's just, so I mean, you can see, like, this is just one of my books, all the different dog ears,
Yes, yes.
you know.
But it should ask you for three passages would be you'd really have to make some painful choices, right? If you had to pick only three.
Well, I think those are the three that I come back to most often than not. I think maybe also the one that I sent you the photos of is, you know, like that pressure of having to always come across from a place of a God instead of just somebody saying something, you know, and that you just say it and you put it out there, and it doesn't have to be anything more or less than that. Yeah, those are the three or four that I probably draw on the most, that I find in conversation surface for me to bring up more often than not.
Tell me about the way that I think it's the third one you mentioned, which is where he runs into his former student, who did kind of see him as in a godlike fashion. Tell me a little bit more about the impact of that on you, that particular passage.
Well, it was the current experience that I was having with my own undergrad experience. And so it gave me something outside of myself with others. It gave me places to draw on and things to consider, places to research, that when I was fighting for my own undergraduate education and trying to figure out what I was going to do, and it told me that process might not have any answer, but that process was very legitimate to not give up on.
So what you're saying is we all go into these processes wanting an answer, desiring certainty. And what you're saying is the transformation into understanding that the process itself was legitimate, and that the final outcome was much less important than actually being in the, you know, holding the quality within the process.
Yeah. And then here's why I went in, introduced everything the way I did. The way the school reacted to I was an up-and-coming athlete, you know, and so the way the school gave the permission they did, and then when they started to realize that I wasn't going to just disappear at the age of 18 in special education, that it was actually working, that I was getting better. Like they were going to have to be accountable then for working with me to stay in school and finish. And they didn't know what that was going to necessarily mean. So in their, like, I was, you know, I finished high school with a 3.8. Like I was, you know, at the University of Colorado, I was a disabled student, but then I went to University of Northern Colorado and I was an honors student. And so living the practice of when an institution or the bosses or accreditation or peers, other students or professors, when they're confronted with that practice of quality, even though they're standing there talking about it, what is it that we can do to cloak ourselves in the rhetoric rather than open it up and say, okay, we don't know what we're talking about, but we're willing to try to work it out. That book at that time normalized that experience for me. And it offered me a level of confidence, along with being in Colorado and my skin color and, you know, I mean, all those other kinds of things. It allowed me to make benefit of that without necessarily attaching my own identity to having that practice succeed. It was my willingness to stay present with the practice is why the success happened, not my trying to dominate and control it and then continue to make it work. So
Okay.
his reflection of that practice in Montana told me that that was a normal thing to do. And that when professors reacted, it was not illegitimate for me to say, help me understand then what your experience is, because seems like it may be something that you and I can work through together. And that wasn't something in the early mid 90s that a lot of professors really expected their students to do. They just wanted me to get a good grade and shut up and leave, you know? And that wasn't what I was there to do. Like, I was there to do this.
I get it. Well, I'm also getting the impression that, you know, after your concussion, you had this period of, you know, where you had to get everything back, right? You had to get back your, you know, obvious, you know, your mental faculties. And it sounds like that this process, what you're saying is this process helped you go from, you know, a concussion survivor who was probably struggling cognitively to where you are now.
Full stop.
Yeah. And which is, you know, a real testament, because, you know, it's very hard for me to believe that you ever had any, you know, anything happen to you that would disable you cognitively. So
Just this conversation.
You're a living testament of, you know, what this process can do if followed.
And just this conversation,
Mm-hmm.
it's, you know, I'm drawing on an energy that isn't like, oh, I'm drawing on an energy. Like, it's easy for people to fill in their own meaning with some of those things, like what you were just sharing. But it's also just really, it's pain. It's a lot of hard work.
Sure.
Like, it isn't,
Exactly.
you know, it isn't always something to celebrate, like put on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And that's something that is so key to so much of like the CBC broadcast that they have with him, where they're sharing the interview where he says, you know, you got to remember, you know, like, please, you may think you know, but you don't. Like, we got to remember, we don't always know everything, and we have to engage with one another in that space. You know,
That's so true. So that's really, you know, so let me segue to, we need to wind up in about 5 minutes. So in this last 5 minutes, you're kind of describing maybe a way that us and our certainty and our desire for certainty and our sense that everything is categorizable, and, you know, it's just variables, and you categorize these variables and then you work with them until you get, you know, you get the outcome you want, and that there's a specific truth and all that. Some of the problems we have these days, right? How would you suggest that we use Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance to address some of the problems that are occurring in this modern world, in this very digitally connected world, in this global world, you know, this global economy, this global culture? What do you think, in, you know, a few minutes, mankind in general could learn from this and use to improve things and take us in the right direction versus the wrong direction?
well, I think it's nothing about us without us, and right to your point there, there's no way that this is just, you know, mankind or human beings alone in any of this. And so for each of us to be able to bring forward what our experience is, and if it's with Zen on the automatic cycle maintenance and sharing how we can model, you know, asking these questions and sharing some of these vulnerabilities and saying, hey, this is one example that we can share right now to go through this, but it's your experience and her experience and their experience that's important. And now, how do we use this to value ourselves, to not forget that this is about not forgetting that person who's sitting in there trying to make sense of what's going on? We need to put the books down and be available for them. And if we can use these stories and these books, well, then use them. But we can't use those to replace the actual sharing of the relationship and extending these conversations to people who can't necessarily always afford taking time to listen like this. And so as we're able to really then do the 180 and then practice these things, showing the vulnerability, showing up for others, instead of telling them to read the book, you know, really being there for them, because they may be that next Robert Piercing, they may be the next Chris. And so really walking that talk. And then when they say, hey, do you have anything to read? Well, then, yeah, I'll recommend the book. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But 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 that practice, I can't think of anything more for me, were I to write a book, I wouldn't want people to have it, bought it and put it on a shelf. I'd want people to just say, well, that was good, but now I want to live my life.
Mhm.
And now my life is better for that.
So you would say that, like to get this book back out in the public again.
We need to talk about our lives.
Yeah.
We need to talk about our own questions, our own specialties, our own disciplines.
Mhm.
We need to talk to each other about quality.
Yeah.
We need to say, hey, peer, are you teaching quality? And what does that mean to you? And then we need to have older people and younger people see us and listen to us, and then have more of those spaces and conversations be what inform the next bits of infrastructure and investments that are made.
So you would say maybe that this book, by reading this book, let's say, you get a sensibility of quality in a way that one doesn't ordinarily, wouldn't ordinarily get. It would be more material understanding that we would have. And you're saying there's a sensibility that you call quality, that if you keep that in the forefront of your experience, can both enrich your experience. In your case, it led you out of a dark time into thriving, and improve relationships, and not, follow that going forward instead of following some kind of prescriptive, some kind of plan.
For some, like the plank on the pirate ship, and you're
Mhm.
tied up, and it's like, oh, we're gonna walk the plank. And that's the thing to fear. In a sense, the plank is the opportunity to get out into the world, and now you're free.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so this is one of those ways that I think can be made accessible, and that we can use, especially now this year, to really help this experience for people,
Mhm.
not just have to be about, publications in a
Yeah,
sense.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, Ramey, I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for coming on. And certainly, if you would like to, you have a lot to say about this book that's really interesting. In a way, I feel like the dialogue with you is this is much shorter than it probably should be, and maybe we should have another talk. So I want to thank you, and I hope to have you on here again.
Bless your heart. Sincerely, thank you. And again, to the practice, if it helps, if it helps the conversation and the dialogue, absolutely, I'm happy to.
Thank you.